Hey everybody, welcome to the Torg Stories Podcast. Today I've got Coach James Janssen from Davidson College. Coach Janssen is the Associate Head Women's Coach at Davidson. He's a native Australian. We talked a little bit about what the scene was like there for him growing up. I was really excited to ask him about the Under-17 World Cup that he just got back from on a recruiting trip in Hungary. So we start off talking about that. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation.
Smart takes the shot, and the Hoosiers with 3 seconds. Go ahead.
But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain and an athlete
and a basket case, a princess,
and a criminal. Does that answer your question?
I love you guys.
Last time we talked, you mentioned you had come back from the U17 World Cup.
Yeah.
So I've got questions about that. Where was it? What were you doing there? Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Under-17 World Cup this year was in a place called Debrecen in Hungary. And I was there kind of recruiting purposes, trying to identify kind of the next bunch of talents. A lot of the players there were really anywhere from kind of the 2023 recruiting class to about the 2025 recruiting class. And good opportunity to see just a range of talent from around the world. And some of it was, we knew some of the kids and we've been in touch and they're active recruits, and some is kind of identifying really next wave of talent. So,
Have you been going to that for years? Has that been off and on?
So I was meant to go. So essentially how it works is FIBA alternates every year between the Under-17 World Cup and the Under-19 World Cup. And I was actually meant to go last year. They held it in the same city last year in Debrecen, and we had 2 players from our team that were playing in that event last year. And unfortunately, I got COVID the week before I was meant to travel there, so I didn't get to go. But this was the first time they've had the Under-17s in 4 years because the last iteration of it was cancelled. And so something that I intend to regularly attend, and I just think it's a great version of basketball to be able to watch.
Would you say, just ballparking, how many Division I staffs are represented from the United States? Is that pretty common? Hard to say.
Yeah, I would say a vast majority of the schools that went there were reflected by people that were recruiting the USA team. And this year, a lot of that Under-17 USA team were uncommitted at the point of the tournament, which is probably a little non-traditional. And so you had kind of all the heavy hitters there for that purpose. And so it's probably in total about 30 schools that circled through at a point in time across the course of the week. And then you've got kind of the usual culprits that do the international thing really strongly.
Yep. You told me that it was good for the soul. So I wonder if you could expound on, what's good for the soul about being there that's different from your usual experiences, maybe recruiting.
Yeah, I think to me the biggest thing is that events like that, there's a passion, there's a pride in representing their country, and there's a purpose of trying to go out there and legitimately prepare and win and scout and all these things that are just not really how the AAU basketball scene works. Like, yes, people maybe are trying to win an EYBL or Under Armour title or an individual event, but the vast majority of people are playing in AAU events with the primary purpose of being recruited. And so it's kind of refreshing to have the opposite happen, where they're there for the basketball reason and there to get experience with hopes and dreams of representing their senior national team at an Olympics or a senior World Cup. And so I think that's a primary part of it. And just the basketball structures and systems that these teams run are just extremely high level and really quite impressive. But particularly the European teams, like you see in the European teams, are just very sophisticated basketball wise for a bunch of what's functionally 16-year-old kids.
Yep. Now, this, you aren't actually going to get to do this, and you can pass on this question, but if you were going to take over travel basketball in the United States and do some things to make it better, what, you got any ideas of some places you would start, or would you just try to think of a way you could more closely replicate that model, or it's not possible in this country?
I think the way that kind of the club basketball and other things work in other countries is it's just so heavily facilitated by the national federation. So I think unless you had a single governing body, being, let's say, USA Basketball, that kind of took the reins and had everything run under its system, I think that that's very difficult to potentially attain. And I guess the way that it works a lot of places is that, yeah, you've got these clubs that play national championships and under that structure, and that's where these players are selected from to play on the national team, or at least identified to be part of high performance environments where those athletes are maybe fast tracked in a single location. So you see in a country like Australia, you have it in the Center of Excellence, which the NBA Academy has taken kind of the model from, and basically based their men's NBA Academy out of that location. But you've got France does the same thing, and really Spain has a similar situation, and even a small country like Sweden has a similar setup where most of those promising athletes end up in the same school or two. And I think it's, what is different is just that collegiate environment doesn't exist outside of the US, and so I think it is difficult with that structure in mind for it to be kind of played out that way. But you do see it, like I will say, like you do see it a little bit more of that international style structure in a sport like soccer,
right? Yeah,
where you have these academies, and I think that's, if I was to be in charge of USA Basketball, I think my model would look a little bit more what US soccer probably looks like.
Good. So what, I think maybe you have 5, or at one point had 5 Australians playing at Davidson. What would motivate someone from Australia, say, to come to Davidson instead of stay where they are? And of course, that varies, of course.
Yeah, and I think everyone's decision is a little different with that. I think the National League in Australia is, and much the same to what the WNBA is. There's not enough teams, and you've got really 8 teams in the WNBL, and that's essentially 80 roster spots that includes 3 imports a team across the course of a whole bunch of ages. And so opportunity to play at that level is really low for a young athlete at the top tier. Now, the second tier competition is really, really strong, and they've done a good job in Australia of consolidating that setup to have a number of different conferences, and now national championship for the first time this year. And so there are alternatives, but I think the scale at which the US collegiate system is, and the resources we have and facilities of coaching, and whether it be film, whether it be strength and conditioning resources, access to practice space, all those kind of things, and the ability to do that at a pretty high level, I think is really appealing, with the addition of having school paid for, right? Like that's a big deal for these athletes too. But I would say probably 70% of the players that come across the school, and not our 5, but the majority of the Australians that end up in situations over here, the school is really a secondary component to their decision-making process.
So we'll circle back. You're from Australia. I'm guessing Australian basketball is different now than when you were 13. So first off, just growing up, you're 10, you're 15 years old, you're 17 years old. What was that scene like? Yeah,
so the 90s was a boom decade of Australian basketball, and I think it could be said a lot of places where, off the back of kind of the 1992 Olympics and the Dream Team, international basketball kind of exploded, and that was very much true in Australia. So growing up, and that's a little bit before, I turned 10 in 1996, but really, particularly in Melbourne, it was massive. Sell out Rod Laver Arena, which is where the the Australian Open tennis is held for kind of the rivalry games, and our national league was thriving in population. Like the basketball population was really strong in terms of the participation level, et cetera. And it went through a little bit of a dark age with some of the professional league, but the participation level was really strong. And growing up in Melbourne, we have just a really robust youth basketball system, and very, very, very competitive. And like, I don't know if there's too many places that can compete with Melbourne in terms of a city of producing the number of NBA first round draft picks that we have. Like Andrew Bogut was from just around the corner from me. You look more recently at a Ben Simmons or a Josh Giddey. Dante Exum was a top 5 draft pick. All these people came out of Melbourne. Matthew Dellavedova came out of Victoria as well. Lots and lots of players that kind of reflect that area, that have done it at that high level and really were a product. And then you can turn the page to the WNBA and you see players like Penny Taylor and I don't want to mention her name, but Liz Cambage would be another that was a product of that system too. So I was someone that was a bit of a late physical developer, and the organization that I was closest to in terms of physical proximity was highly competitive to get into. And so I actually didn't play the highest levels of youth basketball in Melbourne until I was about the age 16, which was a really non-traditional path for a lot of people that I grew up playing with.
So, I mean, I would say, for example, when I was 15 years old, most of my basketball was either in the town park. There was about 10 to 30 guys that would play. I used to keep we didn't have cell phones. I had a list of about 30 names by the phone, and I would just start calling it and say, this afternoon, 2:00. And then a lot of like barns at 8:00 at night. So pretty stereotypically Indiana type of background. So your basketball was more club oriented, not school oriented, right?
Yeah.
The school.
Yeah, so,
Tell me about that, because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, so the system is very vertical, and it's extremely organized, and so a bunch of other countries have modeled their systems off kind of what we have in Victoria, the state that I'm from, and so you have kind of your really rec what probably people over here would consider like their rec league basketball structure, and so we call that domestic basketball, and so that's kind of the entry level. And they have a thing called Aussie Hoops these days, which kind of captures kind of the young kids to partake at maybe 5 through 7 years old, and then you have these domestic programs, and each association. So let's say that Charlotte had their own basketball association that was one club. Well, they might have 10 to 15 domestic programs, rec league teams under their roof. So from there, you get to a point where through under 12s, through under 18s, there would then be a representative side from that association, or a series of representative sides. So let's just use the Charlotte example. Well, Charlotte may then have a team, and there may be a couple of teams out of Charlotte, associations out of Charlotte, maybe in the south, maybe in the Lake Norman area. And then those teams would play on a Friday night, a highly competitive state basketball competition. So they would play against teams from Boone, from Asheville, from Winston-Salem, maybe from Rock Hill, South Carolina, a league structure on a Friday night. And those teams would all have semi-professional programs as well at the pinnacle of them. So this very vertical structure. Now, from a youth basketball standpoint, under the Basketball Australia umbrella and Basketball Victoria umbrella, they would then select the most promising athletes from those states to then be part of more specialized coaching, high performance environments. So that may include camps, that may include early morning sessions, like specialized development sessions with high performance coaches that then lead to that state selecting a team to play in a national championship. And those national championships occur at under 16s, under 18s and under 20s.
Yeah, if you think of yourself as having obtained an education in basketball, right?
Right.
When you think back, what would be, and you may not like the way I phrase this question, answer it however you want. What would be some of the major stops in that education? What you picked up from who or what experience?
Yeah, I think there's there's lots of different ways of approaching that, and I think what I'm fortunate with is that I have had a variety of different experiences just through coach development in Australia, and really like coach development isn't a structured thing here in the United States like it is elsewhere. Like you go to Europe and you have to get a master's in basketball to coach at the highest levels. Here you can be someone that likes to tweet a little bit, and all of a sudden you might have yourself a what you might call a basketball education. So a little bit more structured in that way. I think a good chunk of my exposures came when I first joined the Blackburn Vikings club at age 16, and had a couple of really good coaches through that stretch. It was a really strange situation. I joined the youth team, so the under 18s team, and at the same time joined the professional team of that program, which was really abnormal. So I got exposed to some terrific coaches, terrific players through that process, and shortly after started coaching myself. And I think some of the education came from trial and error, right? And being able to have my own teams that I coached, and very directly coach these youth teams, whether it be from under 12s through under 18s through under 20s, like had a whole bunch of teams of a bunch of different ages. And I think that process really honed my coaching skills. And then in Victoria, we have a really good, solid coach education. So a couple of coaches courses, and being able to participate in some high performance camps as well, as an on-court coach, and be exposed to a variety of different coaches, some that had coached in the US college system, some that are just national team coaches in Australia and whatnot, and befriending them through that process. And I was an avid clinic goer during my time in Australia, really from 18 through 26. Every clinic that was held, I went to, and I think I developed a lot from an education standpoint in that as well. And yeah, then came to the US and got that experience in the collegiate setting too. Which is
a couple of things I'd say that might cause you to think of a few other things.
Yeah.
I grew up in Indiana, mostly on the Bob Knight motion offense. So, those weren't patterns. Those were players were taught to make reads, and there was a lot of freedom within that system. And so I can certainly trace all the way back to then to now about why some of the reasons I coach, why I coach, even though that has evolved a lot. Whereas I might think of the East Coast more as lots of sets, so I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific about, like, and maybe that's not how it worked for you. Like, I coach now because of this and this and this. Can you think of things like that? Or is that maybe not the way you even think about basketball though?
Yeah, it's funny actually. So like I see a lot of coaches or talk to coaches, and they're like, I got this drill from this person.
Yeah,
I got this set because I saw it with this and that. I don't think my brain really works that way, to be honest. I think it's just constantly updating and revising, like a template that I have, and so I do find it very, very hard to navigate that part. I spoke to one of the coaches I used to kind of attend a lot of the stuff he did, is a coach named Guy Malloy, and he's been a longtime professional coach in Australia, and is the current New Zealand national team head coach, and recently been a WNBL coach in Australia for the Melbourne Boomers, who's had a terrific kind of last 5 or so years. And I think I learned a lot from him. But I spoke to him recently and was trying to think about, all right, what are the specifics that I learned from him? And I don't think I could nail those things down, but definitely stuff that's been pumped out by by Basketball Australia over the years through their setup and their style of play has influenced me a lot, whether that's Peter Lonergan, who's the kind of director of high performance down there, has had a big contribution. And then I think stylistically, not so much the X's and O's, but just how I went about it as a coach. We had some terrific professional coaches in Australia through my early childhood, and Lindsay Gaze and Brian Gorgian, and they were the head coaches of the professional teams in my town that were rivals with each other. And Lindsay Gaze is probably almost 80 years old now, and was kind of the grandfather of Australian basketball in terms of making it what it is. And Brian Gorgian came to Australia from the US as a West Coast guy, and he was actually the head coach of the Australian Boomers at the last Olympics. And watching him and Lindsay through the 90s, they were extremely different from each other. Lindsay would sit back and just take it in and watch, and probably was under the was under the belief that kind of the work they put in practice and whatnot, and the idea of just playing relaxed and free was kind of his role as a coach, and not so much making these moves on the fly. Whereas Brian was a little bit more fiery and up and about, probably a bit more defensive minded. Kind of the fire and ice idea of kind of what they brought was just really fascinating to me. And I think just watching that as a young kid really soaked that up, and I think I have both versions of that in some ways. I think I know how to use those dials appropriately.
The next question is about just sort of continuing that, like maybe what ways you've been trying to grow this summer or in the last couple months, and maybe there hasn't been time for that. I'll give you a couple examples, like from my life. I've even mentioned to you before a book by Doug Lemov, The Coach's Guide to Teaching, maybe something like that. But like two things that I would pick up from that are just how much we need our short-term memory to process reads on the floor. And so if you're getting anything from me on the sideline, calling plays, giving you instruction, now you're losing that short-term memory processing ability. You're taking away from that to listen to me, and that keeps me from doing my work on the court. So that would be an area of something that I'm thinking about and sort of preaching or trying to bring everybody around me to think about, which also had to do with and I know that you're conscious of this kind of thing, of just not stopping play very often, about super focused feedback, about trying to be very, we know why we're doing this thing in practice, and we're stopping it for this reason. And now let's start from there and see if we can do that better. So that's kind of like the art of coaching side of it. And then I just spent couple days really going through some Nick Nurse video on what he would call offensive triggers, which I can easily trace back to like that motion offense stuff from Indiana, where our guard comes down and she's got 4 reads she can make that don't come from us based on what she sees, that kind of. So those are sort of like maybe this summer where I spent some of my time with growth, and I don't know if your summer is like that at all.
Yeah, I think like summer is definitely a time to kind of process and go through some of that. I tend to prefer observing and conversations with a lot of that stuff. I think there's different variety of things. The sports psychology stuff is something I'm constantly trying to just get a better grasp of, and speaking to some people in that space has been big in terms of both how I optimize myself as a coach and how I provide the best avenues for our players, in terms of them just feeling like they can play free constantly. I think that's the reality. Whenever you talk to a player that it just suddenly clicks for them, that's usually what they describe. I just finally felt that I was like playing a bit free. I was being more myself, right? That's kind of always what a lot of these kids describe. And so tapping into that a little bit. To me, the World Cup was a great example of just being able to observe. And part of that was spending time talking to other coaches that were there as well. Like you're in a typical AAU event, you're bouncing court to court, and it's a little more difficult to have more lengthy conversations than just niceties with other college coaches. But in this World Cup environment, got pretty extended time to pick some brains and whatnot. I attended the Australian Opals, Australian women's national team training camp for this year's World Championship. They held that in Brooklyn because Sandy Brondello, the head coach of the New York Liberties, also the Australian national team head coach. And
Right.
so I got to attend that and watch, and I think observing that got some ideas on kind of what things look like, and I think really exposed to a different level of physicality and intensity defensively. I think that basketball for a period of the last decade has moved to being probably a little more pack line, gap oriented with things, and the international games kind of bounced back from that and is trying to be a bit more disruptive in things and dictate that stuff a little bit more. I found that really, really quite interesting. And so those are a few ways.
What would you say if I could see, observe, or hear you bringing some of the sports psychology things that you believe, I could see that in your coaching, what would that look like? What would be examples of things you're trying to, if toward making a player feel free, for example?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of strategies, and obviously honing them into like what they're there to do is one thing, and I think the identity piece is a massive part of it as well, especially at Davidson, and I think embracing the whole person, and making them feel safe within our environment is a really big step, that you see a lot of colleges and or a lot of feedback when things maybe go pear-shaped at certain college situations, and a lot of it's always that coaching is very transactional, in terms of you're here for your basketball and you're on scholarship, and that scholarship could go away at any point, and that kind of rhetoric, I think, steering as far away from that as possible is huge. And I think,
and there are certainly coaches making a different choice.
Yeah,
what you're describing, there's other coaches who are certainly making the choice of that kind of threat and challenge consistently.
Yeah, totally. And I think part of it is finding those ways to appropriately support and challenge our players. And I think one thing I really enjoyed talking to a sports psychologist, Stu Singer, who runs Well Performance, who's worked with our team a couple of years ago, and we've stayed in touch. And he's the sports psychologist of the Washington Mystics and a range of other teams and players. And one thing in talking with him is just constantly putting things just outside someone's capabilities, and that you go too far away from that and you don't get the growth. And so I think there's elements of that within what we do, of being like, yeah, well, in this drill, let's stretch them. Okay, but let's not break them. Let's stretch them. Let's build confidence, and get to that point with what we do. And I think what you spoke about in some of the ideas of making things simpler from a basketball standpoint, of reducing that working memory and not trying to instruct too much. And we try to in practices make it clear what we're trying to accomplish from the standpoint of, as a coaching staff, hey, this is actually a teaching heavy segment, so like feel free to stop where we need to with this on these technical elements that maybe we've predetermined, but hey, let's make sure there's other segments that we're letting them play and figure it out themselves, and go through that. So I think those are a couple of ways. I think some of those are, and as I said, I do think there's elements of my coaching that's a little bit more feel-based, a little more natural, and it's the constant revision of this whatever template within my mind of how it works, rather than me being like super intentional about certain things. Mm-hmm. Which maybe someone that observes me coach may not feel that way, but that's how I feel.
This is a question a little bit. The question is about who does what work on the staff at Davidson.
Yep.
I'm bringing a little bit of my classroom work at App State We talk about discourse communities. The Davidson basketball team would be a discourse community. And we also bring in some things related to what's called activity theory, which just points you to different things. And one of the things it points you to is the division of labor. For example, one staff may have a different coach handle the scout every time. Someone else may identify that Janssen's our scout guy, somebody else, so just tell me a little bit about how that works divided up on your staff.
Yeah, we try to, at least the way that Coach Gales approached things here is we've really tried to hire people that are basketball people. And everyone at least has a requisite understanding of kind of how we're going to go about things. And so we haven't gone the approach of, hey, this person is solely a recruiter. This person's solely here for player relationships. That's just not how we believe it kind of should be done. And so we all kind of coach. We've all got different responsibilities. Coach Jasmine and I work primarily with the guards and wings, and Coach Dan and Coach Ariel primarily work with kind of our forward players. So we split things up that way. We typically split up our scouts roughly in thirds. I'll typically do a little bit more of those. Just my continuity of being here has kind of led to some institutional knowledge, you might say, of some of the stuff that just makes sense for me to, at this point, do a little bit more of that stuff. Then you have recruiting roles that are kind of distributed, and we probably have a little flatter structure with that than some places of maybe having regions, or other people might be like, you're responsible for this class, that class, whatever. I handle most of the international stuff, and then kind of dabble where I can in other relationships more locally. So we approach things that way. From a coaching practice standpoint, I think that that's something that like morphs over time, and you get a feel for, and even different energy levels on a day-to-day basis. I think it's really problematic when people are just hearing the same voice all the time. And I think as a head coach, you have to be really careful. Like, I think you only get so many words you get to say to your team across the course of a year, and you don't want to use all those bullets in September and October. You want to make sure come February, March, you have some of those words to still say. And so I think as we've gone with that, it's looked a little different. Right now, my head coach is on maternity leave, so that's been really fun from my perspective as an associate head coach of kind of leading practice a little bit more in that way. And I think within that environment, we've really tried to be quite deliberate about our development of understanding on a practice plan. Hey, Coach Dan, this is what I want you to really kind of keep an eye on in this drill. Coach Jasmine, this drill, this is what I want you to really like hone in on, just to make sure nothing's slipping through the cracks. And I think it is a constantly morphing thing, but we like to approach things with a kind of all hands on deck mentality, that it's not anyone's individual silo to do certain things. And yeah, there's different responsibility. I'll do the scheduling stuff with a non-conference opponents, or we'll all have those different responsibilities. Jasmine will do gear, or Dan's our recruiting coordinator, so he probably has a disproportionate load with the recruiting stuff and at least the recruiting admin stuff. So there's those things, but I would say compared to a lot of staffs, we're probably not as siloed, and we meet a lot.
Yeah. For example, there's things like a budget and a travel schedule, and that, right? And I'm kind of getting at more of that maybe unseen work. So a couple more specific basketball questions, just like, so I think it's fairly cliched at this point to talk about statistics in the sense of points per shot. We might do a little bit of, how many points per possession does the opponent score when we're in this kind of defense? That's about the extent maybe at Watauga High School that we might do. I might be forgetting two things that'll get me in trouble, but just kind of what numbers, do you really pay attention to, or maybe something a little out of the ordinary that some of us might not have heard about?
Yeah, I think one of the things stylistically we do here at Davidson is we tag up, and so we have pretty good access to numbers that aren't on a stat sheet, for example. And so we feel really strongly that reducing the percentage time in transition for an opponent is huge. And you see AU basketball in particular, it's just a track meet up and down constantly. And you look at stats around the country, and it's pretty standard that everyone's about 25% more efficient in transition than they are in the half court. And so we take a lot of pride in trying to be a team that that limits that. And every year looks a little bit different in kind of what that number turns out to be. But that's something that if we went through a statistical package, we would really hunt that number in particular.
When you were saying, did you say tag up? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so we tag up. So basically what that is it's a method of ending offense and starting defense.
Yep.
So it's a systemized approach where you essentially guard the person that was guarding you on the initiation of a shot. Okay, so a lot of teams will send, let's say they send 2 players back. That's the same players every time, or it's the point guard and maybe the high wing and whatever get back, and you've got 3 crashes, or maybe someone sends everyone back. They have no crashes. Well, we in a kind of constructed formula will send all 5 to the glass to their player to create 5 50-50 contests. And so what that does is it basically means that you're matched at that point, and you're really slowing down the opposition's transition opportunities because you're matched up and playing from there. And that's it's a system that was kind of popularized by a coach named Aaron Fern, who's an Australian professional coach. Fern is Fearne. And ironically, he actually is now a collegiate coach over here at the University of Charlotte on the men's side. Now they actually don't tag up, which is interesting, but a lot of teams around the world have kind of gone to that approach. And our feeling with it was, our reason for doing so was we just felt we'd reduced a lot of the gray area in basketball in terms of some of the decision making and things within our offense and defensive structures. And defensive transition was just one. We just found ourselves very frustrated coaching, and our players would get frustrated with those situations just because it was all gray. And you talked about the working memory stuff before. Well, if we can reduce some of that by having a system that minimizes those problems, we felt that would be advantageous for us. So we've been doing it 3 years now. There's a handful of Division I colleges in women's basketball I know that do it. A whole bunch of pro teams in Europe do it, national programs, etc. It's an interesting way to go about it.
I won't go too long on this because the answers to all my questions are just to watch you guys play. So if one, Ellie plays for you, Ellie's man gets the rebound, she's 3 feet from the hoop, she's pressuring the ball and slowing that down. Is that
correct?
Part?
Yep.
And then if I'm guarding you at the 3-point line and you guys shoot and you just stand there, am I standing there with you?
Yep.
So I'm not, I'm next to you. If a ball's close, I go after it. Otherwise, I'm keeping an eye on you.
Yeah. So basically, one of the principles is that you need to go high side of your player. And by high side, we mean towards the middle of the floor. So the middle of the floor, you can choose either way with that. But anywhere else, you're trying to go to the middle of the floor. So if you think about what that means is when someone gets a rebound, a defensive rebound, now they have someone between them and the hoop. Between them and their hoop, right? And so at that moment, or before that rebound happens, our goal is to be physical, to get to that high side shoulder and to drive that player down to create a bigger area of the floor that the ball can go into that we could get. So creating those, as I said, those 5 50-50 contests that any long rebound essentially becomes ours. And obviously other opportunities there as well. Now, the really important thing is we call it the first 0.5 seconds. So the first 0.5, when someone gets that defensive rebound, you've got to do a terrific job in containing the ball, applying ball pressure to allow what over the course of the full court almost looks like pack line defense, where you have gaps and plugs, and
Sure, right.
see kind of when you watch teams play against Giannis and they're building the wall. That's essentially what it should look like for the entire game, regardless of who's guarding the ball.
You and I could probably easily do an hour on tagging up at some point, right? I know you've got bedtime coming up, so I'll just a couple more questions for you. Turning to family a little bit. So you're married, you have a daughter. I forget how old she is. She's maybe
3.
3. Okay, I would have guessed maybe a little older. So 3. We both have daughters named Charlotte. How are you, how's it going balancing family and your job? I know when I was, I think 20, my high school head coach told me if I wanted to have a family that the college coaching route was a pretty tough way to go. So how are you doing with that? And what are some ways that you carve out time for family?
Yeah, it's really challenging. So it's one of these things, and honestly, COVID has made that really tough in terms of kind of what things look like and being able to have your kids around and just being wary of a lot of that stuff. And so I'm honestly excited for kind of the coming years with some of that stuff, of returning to maybe a little bit more normalcy as we go. And we do have one on the way. So we have baby number 2 coming. Thank you. Coming in October. So I may regret any words I say right now about how we're handling parenthood. But I think one of the things, we have a very predictable schedule at Davidson in terms of our practices and how things are approached, and they're in the late afternoon every day. And so I'm able to be kind of responsible for my daughter in the mornings and whatnot, and then trying to be really present at nighttime. I think maximizing the summers is a really, really big part of it too, in terms of the months of May and June, and trying to be present in those situations. But yeah, it's definitely challenging. And I think that the way that I've approached my coaching career so far is I don't want to be one of these coaches that has a different polo every year. I want to be somewhere where I'm embedded in a community. And this is year 6 now at Davidson. And prior to that, it was 5 years at Wake Forest. And I want to be in that scenario where there's just that stability and not uprooting a family constantly. But
I've joked that there are lots of coaches with babies on the way at Davidson. Is that correct?
Yeah. So my head coach is due on Friday. She's getting induced tomorrow. So
oh wow, I didn't know it was right now.
Yep. So literally tomorrow. Our men's head coach has a baby on the way in the next week. So we're on the same cycle.
I think, at least there should be some empathy among coaches for the situation. So I think that could be good.
Yeah, and I think
you guys could have spaced it all out a little better, maybe. But
yeah, and I think to touch on that, like I couldn't imagine probably what it's like to work for a coach that doesn't have family, and doesn't understand those constraints. Like when I'm trying to get home to my 3-year-old, Gail is as well, and so there's that understanding and set empathy, and we get to raise our daughters right now together. They're 4 weeks apart at 3 years old, and so I think that's a really big part of it. But that's something I've done a little soul searching on over the course of the summer, and trying to just build some more community for us to figure out how to do it better, because it is very challenging, and you see a lot of coaches in the professional and collegiate level leaving the game because of family drama and not being able to handle that well. And I want to strive really hard not to be in that boat. And I think it would have been difficult to have had a family really young, like you mentioned, age 20. Well, yeah, if I had had a family as we were figuring this out and trying to get through this from age 20 to 26, that might have been really difficult. But I was fortunate. I was 32 by the time my daughter was born, that we were a little bit more settled in life, which was helpful. Yeah.
Well, best wishes to Gail in the coming days, and best wishes to you guys.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for joining me, Coach.
Yeah, no problem at all.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Smart takes the shot, and the Hoosiers with 3 seconds. Go ahead.
But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain and an athlete
And a basket case. A princess.
and a criminal. Does that answer your question?
I love you guys.